Hey,
Oh, hey.
what was Magic's first 5-color card?
What is it?
The first 5-color card in Magic
Uh-huh.
was Sliver Queen.
What?
Distraction makers.
So we wanted to discuss slivers because
we got our asses handed to us.
we did, in fact, get our asses.
We recently streamed some Commander games with our friend Bells and Eric on their channel, GPTV on Twitch.
On Twitch, yeah.
And probably, it was like turn 5 she killed us?
It was, yeah.
Maybe turn 6?
It was pretty brutal.
Yeah.
It was the first sliver.
I think that's when I started.
Gives all your slivers cascade.
I think that's when I started drinking.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
Although I think you roided out on a C4 before that.
Yeah, that too. It was a rough night.
Yeah, that was nuts.
It was fun.
I thought you were going to die.
I had heart palpitations for like 3 days.
That makes sense.
So, I hate slivers.
You hate? Yeah, this is interesting. Slivers are very polarizing, right? There's players who love them, and there's players who hate them, and I don't really think there's anybody in the middle.
All right, before we get too deep, what the fuck is a sliver?
Oh, this is fascinating,
Yes.
actually. This is actually really cool. Okay. So, let me make sure I get all this right.
Yeah.
Early on in Magic's development, a fan of the game at the time, Mike Elliott, created his own set. The set was called Astral Ways, which later he was brought in as a designer for Magic, and that set became Tempest, which is the first set that slivers are introduced in.
Wow.
They have a very interesting name, right? Slivers.
Uh-huh.
They're called slivers because Mike Elliott, in this plane of existence that he invented, saw that they were sort of two warring gods, right? And one was trying to keep the other one out from the world, and gets destroyed and sort of shattered and splintered into a bunch of slivers. And so the slivers are all sort of pieces of this divine being that have been sort of scattered throughout the world, which is why when they're sort of next to each other, they sort of become one almost.
Why weren't they called splinters?
I don't know. Could have been called shards.
Yeah. Babies.
Pieces.
Yeah. Nubbins. So slivers. So that's what they are.
Chunks.
And really, they're just weird alien-looking things with one arm with a scythe on it.
Right. Well, silly enough, that's how we like to see them. There was a point in time where they tried to make slivers into dudes.
Oh.
It was not a good look.
Oh, okay.
It lasted for 2 seconds.
You'll have to put a...
We don't talk about those slivers.
You'll have to put a card up that looks like that because I don't think I've seen that.
Mechanically, they're inspired by the card Plague Rat that came out in Alpha.
Okay.
Which is sort of this one of the first tribal kindred creatures that have been in the game, where they sort of buff each other, right? So the more plague rats you have in play, the more powerful they are. Which is funny because I think this ends up getting reinvented through Relentless Rats later, which is a card that you can play as many of as you want in your deck, and they all give each other +1/+1.
Gotcha.
Sort of hearkening back to the fact that early on in Magic days there was no limit to the number of cards you could play in your deck.
Right.
So you could play as many plague rats as you wanted.
Right.
But yeah, slivers were inspired by this idea of creatures that are sort of giving each other bonuses just by being on the board together. Well, that's basically it for the history of slivers. But let's talk about some of the sort of design implications and why we think they're ultimately good for the game.
Yes. So I jest when I say that I hate slivers. I think slivers are interesting. Slivers, to me, the positives when I'm looking at slivers is that they essentially this is a good phrase, maybe. Slivers are the kicker of tribal synergies.
Yeah,
basically, yeah.
Explain. But
what I
understand.
mean by that is it's a reference to us talking about how every mechanic is either kicker or cycling. And what I mean when I say that slivers are the kicker of tribal synergies is that slivers they have very, very straightforward synergies where you play a sliver and its effect is all other slivers get this thing, or all slivers get this thing. Usually it's slivers get flying, or slivers get lifelink, or +1/+1, or whatever it is. And the majority of the time when you have what's in Magic is called tribal synergies, or recently called kindred synergies, is that you basically you have different types. So you have vampires or dragons or merfolk or whatever. And those types tend to support each other. So you have one merfolk card that says anytime a merfolk enters the battlefield, you draw a card or something like that. And what slivers do is slivers basically take that and say, you do everything. You do everything ever, as long as you have slivers that let you do everything ever.
Right. Each sliver gives its ability to each other sliver.
Yes. And what that does is it sort of creates this interesting sort of baseline idea or understanding of what like a tribal synergy is.
Yeah.
Which is saying if you make a deck and you just throw a bunch of slivers in there, as long as you got a decent mana base, like you're good. Like
right, yeah.
you'll get some cool stuff.
It'll be fine.
Yeah, you'll build up some big slivers.
It'll work out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think something that we should touch on in terms of like why tribal/kindred design is important is a way to introduce new players to deck building in like a really intuitive way. Basically, it's like, okay, well, pick whichever sort of. I think I don't know about most, but a lot of players are introduced to deck building in this way, where they're like, okay, well, what do you like? Do you like elves? Do you like goblins? Do you like merfolk? Do you like slivers? What creature type, sort of zombies? What resonates with you?
Right.
And then once you have that and understand that, then you can sort of go, oh, well, okay, I can just look up a bunch of zombie cards, and they all kind of go in the same deck together, and I can pick and choose here and there which ones I want to include, but tons of different things are just pre-made for you there. It's a way to chunk the complexity of deck building immediately and put you in a space of like, okay, well, I don't have to worry about all of the cards of Magic anymore. I just have to worry about the ones that fit within my tribal/kindred idea.
It's a fantastic way of getting just an entry point into the game for any new player. And in fact, when I was getting back into Commander, I was like, okay, I don't really want to think too deeply because I don't know the differences of Commander format to all these other formats or what's going to be good or bad or whatever. So I just looked at my own collection and was like, well, I got some good dragons, so I'll make a dragon deck.
Dragon's another good one.
Yeah. And so that was like my logic. It made a basic dragon, synergy deck or whatever, and then from there I expanded on that. But and when my wife was getting into it, she was like, "Oh, vampires sound cool." And I was like, "Okay, great, I'll make a vampire deck," and it makes it very easy to kind of onboard someone into this deck building process.
So before we move into the negatives, we've been seeing some growth in our channel, and we very much appreciate the support we've been getting. So, if you like the videos we're making, give us a like, give us a subscribe, like and subscribe. And we appreciate it. Thank you. So negatives.
Yes.
What do we feel like are the major drawbacks in terms of sliver design philosophy?
I think it's tough to say that there's a drawback because if the intention is, look, let's make simplest like tribal synergy that you could do, where you put this in, you get an outcome, right? So all slivers that you play end up getting lifelink or flying or menace or whatever, insert keyword here. I think it's a great way of like onboarding people into that sort of like tribal synergy. But I think it doesn't exactly, teach nuance in deck construction. And I think that when I look at tribal decks in particular, that's almost always like the toughest thing, is that the first step I feel like when anyone kind of gets on board into Magic is almost always through some sort of tribal kindred deck where it's, okay, I want to make dinosaurs, I want to make dragons, whatever. And then getting them past that hurdle into the next step of moving beyond just like types and into maybe an archetype of a deck, or into like a deck that has a very specific win condition or something like that, is usually pretty tough because it's a lot harder to understand.
Yeah.
And I think that Slivers is like way more difficult. Slivers is like the base, which I think is great, but to expand upon that, I think is very difficult. And I don't know. Maybe I don't know enough about Slivers. I don't know if there's any Slivers that sort of like help alleviate that.
Not really.
Okay.
So we have a video about parasitic design, and tribal/kindred stuff is sort of one of the best examples of sort of parasitic design, where like you have to play a whole lot of this type of thing to get the payoffs, right? Like you can't just put like Lord of the Undead or whatever in your deck and get a payoff. It gives all other zombies +1/+1.
Okay.
And it's other zombies.
Other zombies,
right?
right.
So like you can't just play him, right?
Right.
And so this problem kind of compounds with slivers too, right? You're playing you can play just one sliver sometimes, but oftentimes you're much better off playing a ton of slivers. And so really the danger zone of this type of design philosophy is that you kind of can end up in the space where these types of decks end up playing very similarly to each other, in that like what one sliver deck does is probably very similar to what another sliver deck does. This isn't entirely true, and there was a tournament level deck played early on that used slivers in kind of a different way, in that would counter spells and things. So it's sort of using slivers as more of a counter spell interaction, instead of like, I have a bunch of slivers and I'm trying to just rush and kill you, basically. Long time ago. Tempest, basically. And so those types of things did happen back in the day, but in general, when players build a tribal/kindred synergy type deck, they kind of tend to play out pretty similarly.
I think that, Commander has changed this slightly, where sometimes if you have a commander that has a very specific or a very consistent sort of an effect, it can change some of your play pattern, or maybe some of like how you lean. So you could have, vampire deck, or you can kind of have this like vampire aristocrat sort of hybrid. And then on top of that, there's also different colors. So like, okay, well, maybe you're playing a vampire deck that uses red vampires, and you get more into madness effects and stuff. And like, there's a little bit more variety, but yeah, generally it's. I'm trying to think about how we've phrased it in the past. It feels a little bit more like you're not designing the deck as much as the deck is designing itself.
Yeah, feels a little like paint by numbers ish or whatever.
Yeah.
Honestly, Slivers I think suffers from this almost more than other tribal decks, because one is 5 colors. So you're not really able to get like I could make a zombie deck that's black, that's mono black. I can make a zombie deck that's black and blue. I can make a zombie deck that's black and white. And those feel different than each other. They're still zombies, so they feel somewhat similar. But at least you're getting sort of that color differentiation. Yeah. Where the commanders that Slivers play are almost all 5 color.
Right.
So you kind of get like, okay, so you've got like first Sliver that gives all your Slivers cascade, and then you have like Sliver Overlord, which lets you like search up Slivers, Sliver Queen, which does her own thing, and that's about it, like, and so I think that Slivers are cool and very flavorful and interesting and feel neat, but like I think the novelty kind of wears off over time.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the, kind of detriments potentially to creating something that is so sort of like universal within itself, I guess.
And I mean, when we're talking about like trying to set your players up for success by having that sort of introductory thing is fantastic.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, and some games have done this, but it's very difficult for games to then take that sort of introductory point that a player starts interacting with the game and still have it expand and be interesting to later players. And in fact, actually, there's an example of this in a Richard Garfield game called Spectromancer. And I played only a little bit of Spectromancer, but they've discussed the data that they collected on their game Spectromancer, and that it's a class-based card game. And they have a free class that you can play as the cleric. And the cleric is apparently pretty standard. It's pretty basic class. It's nothing crazy, nothing special. It does everything sort of generally okay. But a lot of players got upset and were like, oh, the cleric kind of sucks. And we don't really like the cleric. And when they were looking at the data and evaluating what players actually were doing, what ended up happening is like beginning players liked the cleric because it was the first class that they got used to, and then they got a new class, and then they stopped liking it. So there's this huge swath of players in the middle that didn't like it. And then the higher end players are like, actually, the cleric's like really good. Yeah. And like they start playing the cleric. That's really tough to get.
Yeah.
And I think unless you have some other interesting points of interaction that you can do, or other ways of expanding upon that sort of like synergies that you're creating with that type of a deck, it's very difficult to try and maintain interest with multiple layers of your demographic.
Right, and I think there is sort of a risk too, right, where you're introducing players to this particular type of synergy, and then you're asking them to kind of like like where's that transition point like you mentioned before?
Yeah.
Is there a way for Slivers to kind of like bring players into the sort of the other synergies of Magic, the other strategies? And it's going to feel a little weird, I think, in that you're like, well, all my Slivers got to like make all my other Slivers better, and like it just doesn't really work that way with these other types of strategies.
Right.
So
it'd be cool to see them expand upon that, though, right? Like doing. I mean, even exploring it first in Commander and then seeing it in other sets, but looking into Commander, it's like, are there Slivers that are commanders that are only 2 colors, 3 colors,
Yeah.
and it would limit the pool of Slivers that you can have.
might be a good way to do it.
Yeah, and then suddenly you can then generate other types of Slivers in those specific colors that maybe have other points of interaction that are more color specific.
Right.
It'd be interesting to see.
And it's not to say that you can't build a Sliver deck leaning one direction or another.
Right.
But yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, what are some, I don't know, I guess we kind of already talked about takeaways, but
Yeah, I mean, major takeaway is just having any sort of an onboarding that is, it's like, you talk about first order optimal decision making when thinking about strategy in a game, but this is also from a deck construction standpoint. How do you get someone invested in your game without them having to think too much about it? Because
Right.
deck construction, super complex subject. So how do you make that as simple as possible for someone to be like, I just want this?
right.
Starter decks are great, but starter decks usually, aren't just a specific type or something. It's usually trying to do a particular thing.
Yeah.
So making sure that someone can just find a deck that is something that they are interested in is, I think, a good way of getting people invested.
Right. And you bring up a good point with the first order optimal strategies, meaning that like there should be a sort of logical first like strategy that you feel like is good. Then the thing that you want to be careful of is making sure that first order optimal strategy is not just the best strategy.
Right.
Because then you end up having just a real lack of depth.
Yeah. And Slivers are too good. I hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, that's the takeaway. Slivers are too good.
That's my takeaway.
Yeah. This is another way that Slivers help players grow. Is that when you first play against them, you think they're really good, and then you realize that they're not that good.
I'm gonna play Lantern Control.
In Commander?
Sure.
Good luck.
I know.